Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Africa iShare podcast. It's nice to do this again, and I'm with Chris, and I will let Chris introduce himself and then get the discussion started. Quite some exciting stuff we'll be speaking about this week. So, Chris, welcome.
Hi guys. Chris Mwabe, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. So I'll be moderating today's talk. It's an interesting talk. I'm moderating because Christine has some exciting news. Africa iShare recently got invited to give. So basically, Christine was representing Africa iShare it was a Commonwealth meeting for African countries, and she gave a talk on Africa and tech, which we shall get into deeply. But before that, maybe Christine, just a few issues. How was the concept? Not the concept, the meeting generally. Just before you get to the talk, how's the meeting in terms of organization, in terms of who organized it, and how did they approach Africa iShare?
Okay, thanks, Chris. So Africa iShare was to give a talk at the Commonwealth Africa Initiative Summit. So it's a summit that happens every year because there's a Commonwealth Day. So the Commonwealth Day was being celebrated on the 14th of March. So the Commonwealth countries, which includes the African countries and other countries within the Asia, and anyway, every country that is within the Commonwealth. So it's this event which the UK and the Queen will preside over and celebrate the Commonwealth. Apparently, the Commonwealth is the biggest organization after the UN in terms of the countries involved, and I think the events that happen. And it's quite magnanimous how the Commonwealth is organized, and how I think at least how seriously the UK takes it. So Chris, so it was now the Africa chapter of Commonwealth, which is like the Commonwealth Africa Initiative, who was organizing the event. So it was quite interesting because there are people who are coming to give different perspectives of African issues, including people like from the COMESA and diplomats from different African countries speaking about different issues. So it was quite interesting, and it was nice that Africa iShare was invited, which the invite until now I'm not sure on what basis Africa iShare was invited, because most of the other people present were either government officials, even if the Commonwealth Africa Initiative tries to work with the private sector and people within Africa. So I imagine that was the basis on which Africa iShare was invited. But it was quite an interesting event, and the entire trip, to say the least. Chris, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like.
Yeah, you just left out the part that you went to the UK, but that's okay. So what topic was Africa iShare given to discuss?
Okay, so yes, of course, this was happening in London, and the topic for discussion was how tech can be used to help African economies with post-COVID recovery, and the entire topic, the bigger theme of the event was Africa post-COVID, which I think, Chris, is quite interesting because I think what I personally found interesting is that there's a view of a reality about Africa, which is not the reality in Africa. And how I say it is that when someone is speaking about what's Africa's position post-COVID recovery, the people who want to comment about it are people who are, I think, detached from the reality of what happens in Africa, because when you think about it honestly, COVID has not been such a big threat to African lives as I think the world thinks it is. If you consider even in Europe, I would imagine Europe in terms of like the deaths, was more affected than Africa. And even in terms of the economies, of course, Africa was affected because, we are interlinked globally, but Africa is not as affected. So I also found generally within the discussions that people were having that they were quite detached on what actually is the reality in Africa. So Chris, I'll actually go into like some of the when the conversation started about tech, the views that people had, which I thought were very detached from the reality in Africa. Of course, not everyone. There's those who had a very good grasp of what happens in Africa, especially those who live in Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It even ties to our last topic, the last discussion I think I was on, when we were saying the expectations about the effects of COVID on the African countries. They expected Armageddon to happen, and this didn't happen. So you might find some people still have those biases, even in terms of our reaction. In their minds, they still think we bore the brunt, and maybe they are thinking towards how we should. Their reactions towards us is a bit biased. So maybe we'll get into that when you're discussing. But before we get to their reactions, maybe you should give us a short breakdown of what the gist of your discussion, what you basically told the crowd at that at the Commonwealth meet.
Okay. So as you can imagine, Chris, coming from Africa and knowing the reality of things are not as crazy as someone, even an African person living in the UK thinks they are. And also, I think coming from Kenya. So some of the thoughts that in honesty, I think, and what I was presenting is that tech is a way that can help improve the economies of African countries. And this is not post-COVID, ignore COVID. Fourth industrial revolution, the reality of where the world is at right now, tech is something that Africa could benefit from. And I remember like one of the main points I was making was that because we operate in a global value chain, and this means that there's no country in the world right now that can say that it's producing 100% of its products without relying on someone else. So you find like, for instance, even German-made cars, they will be assembled in Germany, but they will use tech from the US or from China or from somewhere else, so that someone has the raw materials, or they have some part which they need something else from another country to be able to assemble and keep a product. So that's how the global value chains, production chains are interconnected. And what I was saying is that if Africa specialized in not just the minerals that we are exporting and the raw materials, but also in like coming up with tech products and solutions, especially that work within Africa, to export even to someone who is coming to set up in Africa. So consider like if Amazon wanted to really come big in Africa, the delivery system in Africa is quite different from the UK, the US, because like street names are not like well marked here, or at least everywhere. So if someone came up with a tech solution that can be integrated and sold to even like a Google that could work in Kenya, that's a very good solution that could get some grounding for Africa. So anyway, so my thought was that Africa, like there's a huge room for what Africa can do on the tech side, and there is potential and capabilities for people, of course, if skills are developed, for that to happen. So that was generally my perspective on the whole topic, and this was notwithstanding COVID or no COVID, because I think the discussion should be irrespective of COVID. Even if COVID never happened, then African economists would need to have tech. Yeah,
makes a lot of sense, I think. And so from being that being the gist of your discussion, so we had this discussion before, of course, the recording, and you're telling me you got some very interesting views. Mm-hmm. Probably you should start with the most interesting view, just for our listeners to hear what people actually think out there about the African situation. And maybe even as we have that discussion, maybe I can jump in and try to put myself in the shoes of that person, because we can't also they're not here to actually give us a perspective of what informed their thinking, but maybe I can try put myself in their shoes, and maybe try to see from their perspective whether or not they gave a valid opinion, or it was just them being biased, and probably we don't want to mention things like racism and the likes. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, Chris, also is that some of the people a majority of the people actually who made these comments were not even white. They were Africans who have lived, I think, their entire lives out of Africa. So if you ask me, they are very out of touch with what is the reality in Africa. And also, the thing is that they are still considered the experts on Africa, even if they're out of touch with Africa. That's the bad thing, because they're an expert about something which they only have by, I think, origin and not experience. But so like one of the very interesting views someone had is that we are jumping the gun by focusing or even speaking about technology in Africa, when what we should be focusing on is electricity connectivity. So in their view, they thought it's irrelevant to even start speaking about like how tech can be used. What the discussion should be is that how can we get electricity connected across Africa? I found it very fascinating.
Do you think it's because of lack of information, or it's just people are just because before I'd excuse somebody for having such given fine, we are not fully connected on electricity 100%, but do you think maybe it's just laziness in terms of intellectual laziness? This information is on Google. If you want to get the maybe internet connectivity or electricity connectivity percentages of various countries in the world, you would. Do you think it's just because they are lazy and they decided to assume Africa is still at the same position we were at, or it's just there's no information for them to feed, to use, to be able to understand that we actually at a level where some countries in Africa can actually provide electricity to certain countries abroad, because you'd find a country like, let's say Morocco, if I'm not wrong, or one of these countries just near Spain and the likes, actually exports a lot of energy to Spain. So do you think it's just intellectual laziness, or it's just people they don't have information?
Okay, so Chris, I could understand a bit of what they were saying, because I think they were speaking in terms of Western African countries, where they were saying there's a lot of load shedding, blackouts that happen, and if their point was that there needs to be more electricity supplied to the national grid, or that blackouts need to be reduced, which I would imagine blackouts can happen anywhere, then that I understood. But I also think it's because the issues are textbook issues that they have. So if someone, the last thing they read about Africa is that electricity is a problem, then I think that's what they have stuck to as a talking point. Because what I was telling them is that, and the other thing someone would say is that, let's even assume there's electricity. How about the cost of electricity? And I'll be like, okay, that's fair. Maybe the cost of electricity needs to come down, but which is an issue, especially for the manufacturing sector and such things. So I think there's just, I think, lack of follow up on what you've read in a newspaper or on textbook to realize what's the reality on the ground. But then also maybe there's a point as to the cost of electricity. But the interesting thing is that someone else spoke and said, but if you consider the cost of even fuel, because they even started considering fuel prices, they were like, the cost of fuel prices in the US and in the UK is not anything, it's not as low, especially right now compared to Africa. So again, I think it's just a thought that Africa just is not doing well on the basics.
Again, I'm here now being the devil's advocate. I think if I put myself in the shoes of, maybe it's interesting that you said it's West Africa, because we know, a shout out to one of our guys who normally comes, John Nona from Nigeria. He was telling me in a town like Lagos, you have to have a backup generator, because the load shedding there is crazy. There are the blackouts, and so maybe if it was somebody from the West African part of Africa, from a West African, then you'd understand maybe their thinking, or maybe somebody whose origins are from that side. So there are even songs by there people like techno, in their songs, they say the generator wants to tear their ear. It's always on, the generator. There's a lot of crisis in terms of electricity in that parts of Africa. So maybe if they're from that origin, or you would understand their thinking. So what other views are people bringing forth in terms of what Africa iShare had to say?
Okay, Chris, also, I think I understood and I understand the point about the load shedding, which is an issue. South Africa, I think it's a thing that there's jokes always about how ESCOM decides what it will exercise load shedding each week, because it's really, I mean, South Africa load shedding is worse than Kenya, but that doesn't mean that their tech is not advanced. I mean, South Africa's tech is really ahead of like how much tech is being used, even ahead of Kenya. But anyway, that aside, well, I thought some of the other points were quite helpful, like possibly Africa needs to stop using fiber optic cables to rely on internet, and instead use more advanced satellite source of internet and different types of connectivity, because using fiber optic cables is becoming outdated, and it's one of the reasons why the cost of internet is very high, because they have to be laid across through the ocean, inland. There's a lot of, when you could use just a satellite option, which is easier to access. So that I found that was like quite interesting, like as a solution to what Africa could be looking at in terms of advancing the internet. And then also like maybe rules on how much the cost of internet to be reduced across Africa. That might be a bigger thing to focus on if the use of tech is to see the light of day. Yeah.
Progressive way of thinking by there. Or before we jump to this, I thought now, even the Kenyan scenario, we always have a running joke that whenever it rains KPLC, Kenya Power decide to do their thing. But I think the issue of moving from fiber optic to satellite, okay, I'm not that technologically advanced, but I think it sounds, on face value, it sounds like something progressive to talk about, as opposed to maybe issues with thinking we don't have power. And I'm in full agreement. The fiber optic infrastructure, it's very expensive. Fine, Kenya, we've been lucky enough to have it, but you'd find not so many countries actually have the willpower and also have this economic situation to put this infrastructure on board. So maybe that is something for the people in the high places to think about, and maybe to enforce, to help, because internet and just technology generally, even face value, it's a starting point for creation of jobs, because once you have internet, there's so much, you're in another world, you're in another space, there's so much you can do with the internet and create job opportunities for yourself. And I think Africa as a whole, economically, we're disadvantaged in terms of job creation. We don't have jobs. So one small gesture in terms of just even providing internet all over Africa would, it won't be the cure to our joblessness, but it would go a long way in helping in terms of joblessness, in my opinion. So I think that whoever gave that opinion is a bit more progressive than somebody who actually thinks we still don't have power across.
And Chris, now that you mentioned about like people in higher places who could make a difference, that was the other thing that people felt very strongly about, that the cure for African problems is not use of technology, but the leaders who are bringing down Africa. And that was like, even in this discussion about tech, like one of the people kept saying that, but the leaders don't understand what tech can do. So the leaders are so outdated in their thinking that even when you tell them we need to like get this different kind of cheaper option for tech, they will not understand. So we cannot go anywhere, which in honesty for me, I thought it was a self-defeating. If you think that way, it's self-defeating for Africa, because and my view was that within Kenya, the private sector, if they're like Safaricom, for instance, which anyone listening to this, Safaricom is the big telecom company.
Subsidiary of Vodafone, actually.
Yes, subsidiary of Vodafone. And the private sector actually can have a big part to play in even getting the more modern tech. And my view was that, especially when we speak about tech and the economic growth, we are not saying it's the public sector who should drive it. Having internet, as you're saying, can create jobs in the private sector. It gives room for someone to be innovative and creative in the private sector. So it doesn't matter if the president knows nothing about TikTok or knows or cares nothing about the newest invention. It doesn't matter, but let it be available to the private sector. So I don't know what your thought is about that, because that was a real big thing that people felt that Africa is going nowhere because the leaders don't understand tech.
To be honest, and I'm going to be very blunt about it, I think it's a very lazy way of thinking, because there's what we call a delegation principle. The president is not a master of everything. He cannot be a jack. He can be a jack of all trades, but he can't be a master of all. He delegates. There's a reason why there's a ministry, let's say for Kenya, there's a ministry of ICT, and somebody who's qualified enough is given that docket, and he has his team, whether lean or not, that deals with that area. So saying that the people in high places do not get are outdated, or it's a bit unfair to those guys, given some of them have never used a computer or something in their life. But because we have this obsession about age, we elect the oldest people around. So, but it's not a valid reason. I think the more valid thinking for me would be, my opinion would be, corruption is kills a lot, because you'd find money comes in from donors or from wherever to help in terms of internet, ICT, and them, but that money goes into people's pockets. So maybe, for example, in Nigeria, you'd find there's a ministry for energy or ICT or whatever, money comes in, and you'd find this minister, instead of solving the problems in that energy sector, he's bought a generator for his house as a backup. So it's not, I think corruption is what is killing us. You'd find funds from Kenya Power were looted, and some people are to be extradited to some countries because, So I think for me, it would be more of corruption as opposed to people being outdated, because you can easily delegate. And then the other interesting thing you've said in terms of the private sector, the government can give incentives to the private sector. You can give them tax breaks. You can do public-private partnerships. There are so many ways you can bring in the private sector to help in terms of putting up this infrastructure, or even just teaching guys on how to use tech. And there's so many ways. Like, if the government is serious, they can do it. They have all the tools. So because for example, if I own a private entity and you're giving me a tax break just so that I can set up some tech, or you're giving me incentives, maybe you waive my custom duties, or there's so many ways. Or we do it in partnership, whereby maybe it's a turnkey, what we call turnkey projects, where I do the development, and there are so many ways you can do public-private partnerships. So it's very interesting. I think knowing for example, the Kenyan government, it would be more prudent if the private sector was brought on board to do these projects, because they have the expertise, they have the connections and the government just facilitates the legal environment, the laws, and regulates it, and we'll be okay. So I think it's very interesting coming from you that the private bodies can be brought on board and they can help.
Yeah. And also on that, Chris, actually I've remembered one of the other people who had come to speak was a private investor. This is I think one of the wealthy people in the UK who is looking to invest in Africa. And that's actually what he was saying, that what we need is an environment where we can come and invest in the private sector. Let's be able to come and set up these tech options in Africa. Let's come and develop it. And they were in fact, I thought this person was very progressive in their thinking. They were saying that you don't need to rely on the government, because they're there are some very good things that are coming from Africa which are influencing the world, and they're coming from the private sector. And the example he was giving is the Afrobeat So apparently, I think he used to be a musician at some point, because he says that Afrobeat purely developed in Africa. It's influencing the Western music, and this is a genius thing that has come from off Africa, and this has been developed by artists in Africa with no help from the government. So the private sector, the person working alone to develop something within Africa, can influence the world as much as you guys are doing with the music, which I thought was pretty interesting. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I think generally what I'm getting from your experience in the meet was that there's a lot of potential for Africa in terms of tech. Even pre-COVID, there was a lot of potential. We just need to harness it, and we'll get somewhere. I think that's what I'm getting from the gist of the talk you had at the Commonwealth meeting. And now that our time is coming to an end, I think it will be prudent to say thank you to our listeners, because probably they got to know of the podcast from maybe one of our listeners, or from people sharing, or from viewing, and it would be prudent for us to say thank you. And from my side, we hope to have other engagements and other invites out there, and probably next time I'll go, you never know. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you to the people who have taken time, even the Commonwealth Africa people who took the time, whether to listen to one of our discussions or to just learn what Africa iShare does, so that they can think this is people who can have input into this discussion, because really what we've been trying to do is give input, share ideas, and start conversations. It was very nice to be part of a conversation at that level. So yeah, it was a good opportunity. Very thankful for it. And yeah, of course, Chris, going forward, now that you're going to be a more serious part of this, then future opportunities exist. Yeah,
I've always been serious, but anyway. Good evening to our viewers, to our listeners.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We will do this again.